Thank you very much, and congratulations on this occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, may I convey Mr. T. Suzuki's apologies for not being present here. He had accepted to be the chief guest, but unfortunately could not come for unavoidable reasons. The consequence is that I'm here before you, and I'm here because Mr. Kapoor, your president, is not a person who takes no for an answer. So if he tells you to do something, you do it. But I would, in any case, apologize in advance to those who may be disappointed by this turn of events. We are talking of mobility today. The Indian automobile market has really reached globally significant levels. Volume in India is not a problem. Last year, we were the fifth largest automobile market in the world. This year, we should surpass Germany and reach the fourth place. By 2020, we should cross the sales in Japan, and the potential is still very large. So it tells you that we would be amongst the top 3 car markets in the world. And so the question of volume is not going to be something which we should worry about, but what the form of mobility is another matter. But the fact that we will have the need for a large volume of vehicles for mobility is clear. India has also become a manufacturing hub for export of cars. Last year, the exports were 870,000 units. Several car companies are using India as a manufacturing base, and more are likely to do so in the future. As government policies and actions further improve the environment for doing business and manufacturing, this volume of exports from India is bound to grow. The automobile component industry has been growing even faster than the automobile industry has been growing. All of you are participants in making this happen, and my congratulations for what you have achieved. Component exports are actually over 25% of domestic sales, which is not a small number, and should continue to increase rapidly if we also keep paying attention to improving technology and quality levels. I'm making these predictions about the component industry and the automobile industry because I believe that the government of India is putting in place a new economic infrastructure that will place India on a sustainable and high growth path. The past structure which was created in the last 60 years was actually not a culture which was conducive to competitive manufacturing. And I think that is now changing. And I think when this happens, more and more companies will shed their past inhibitions and will want to reach global scales of volume and technology and change their management systems to enable this to happen. The rapid growth of car sales every year means that the total car population in India is becoming larger and larger every year. This poses new challenges both to the government and to the industry, because these challenges will determine the subject of your seminar today and the policies which will come. First, let's look at crude imports. As vehicle population keeps rising rapidly, the requirement of importing crude oil will keep increasing rapidly. What this means is that not only will the foreign exchange required become larger, and partly this can be offset if we increase exports rapidly, but it also means that the dependence on getting supplies of crude from a few limited sources, that dependence will keep increasing. And the question which many people ask is that when does this risk of being dependent on such large energy imports from a few places become unacceptable? Is it something which we can live with, that we are going to have a very large import of fossil fuels from a few limited countries, because India's sources are obviously limited? And I think that is something which has to be built into our thinking and future strategies, that to what extent should we or can we reduce our energy dependence on the outside world. We are all, of course, aware that as vehicle populations increase in the country, the environmental and safety factors are going to become more and more important, and I think that has been raised by Mr. Gadkari and others from time to time. So government actions as well as industry actions will have to take into account these factors, which are obviously very relevant to the growth of the industry in the future. In recent years, the generation of power from renewable sources has gained considerable traction. Solar and wind power have become quite competitive in terms of cost. There are still issues regarding storage of the energy that require better solutions than exist at present, but it is in all our long-term interest that we use clean energy to the greater extent possible, so that that helps to reduce the dependence on imported energy. Mobility in the future has to recognize this, and the government's push for electric vehicles to be used as quickly and extensively as possible is really a derivative of this need to reduce energy dependency on limited sources, looking at what will happen some 5, 10 years in the future. Because somebody has to look at the future. And I think that's what needs to be recognized. As vehicle manufacturers, I think we are also all really aware, once we think of it, of this need for reducing the dependence on energy imports. And for that reason, I think all of us would recognize that EVs have to be used. We have to move towards a larger and larger use of EVs. And as an industry, we have a responsibility for making EVs acceptable to the present users of automobiles, as well as those who will move into the automobile market in the future. This is the challenge before us. Of course, this requires conducive government policies and support to enable us to do that. But the basic responsibility is really for us, because the consequences of not doing so is going to affect us. And it's those who are affected ultimately by the consequences who need to take the action and not rely on somebody else to do it. In the past, the sale of cars and its growth has largely been determined by the affordability of the vehicles and the incomes of the people who are going to buy the cars. Along with that, the spread of the sales and service facilities and the availability of financing have been the other factors which have influenced the growth of the car market sales. These factors are going to remain relevant in the future irrespective of what the fuel requirement is for the mobility which takes place, whether it's EVs or whether it's fossil fuels or it's some other alternative fuels. That's something irrelevant. What is relevant is that affordability, financing, and the ability to serve the customers is going to be very important. For EVs to come in, and that is really one of the major objectives today before us, it does mean reducing the cost of EVs. And as Mr. Firodia said, the battery is the main element of cost in an EV. And therefore, reduction of battery costs is important. All experience shows that localization and volumes are the two factors which reduce costs. Suzuki, along with Toshiba and Denso, are already establishing a plant for making the lithium-ion batteries in Gujarat. And hopefully that will be the first step towards local manufacture of the battery cells, which will help to reduce the cost of batteries and as volumes increase. The second requirement is that customers should be able to use their cars whenever they want to do so and wherever they want to do so. I think those are the two major factors which we have to bear in mind: the ability of the customer to accept that he can use his car whenever he wants, wherever he wants. For electric cars, this really means the ability to charge the batteries with the same convenience as today's cars have in terms of filling petrol or diesel. That, I think, is the biggest challenge, because in India, where most people do not have facilities at home or in offices to park their cars and have a plug-in point where they can charge the batteries, it becomes an environment which is different from elsewhere. And I think that is one of the challenges which has to be overcome. Since building this infrastructure for charging batteries at an all-India level, because that is required if you want to go wherever you want to go, wherever you want to drive, it poses challenges and would take time. We cannot even today visualize all the problems which will come in if we try and build this kind of an all-India infrastructure. And I think because of this, the government is trying another very innovative idea of battery swapping. This is now going to be tried out, and I think we will watch this with great interest because it would help all of us in determining what kind of strategies we should use in future when we go towards larger production of electric vehicles. Now, the question is, what impact would the EV policy have on the component industry? I think Mr. Firodia has already talked about this, because, to some extent at least, because in terms of the powertrain and the engine component industry. But what I want to say is that the replacement of conventional cars by EVs would essentially mean that the engine and its management system as a total, including the drivetrain, would be replaced by the battery and the motor. It would give new opportunities for manufacturing for those who were involved in this area of manufacturing. But the other part of this which you must remember is that irrespective of whether it's EVs or any other fuel which we use, the requirement for mobility will not decrease. The demand for people to move from place to place will keep increasing as the economy increases, people's income increase. Everywhere in the world, rise in incomes has been accompanied by a greater demand for mobility, and that is happening in India, will happen in greater measure as we go forward. So the total volume of automobiles, I'm not talking of what will drive them, is not going to get significantly affected by any of this. And therefore, leaving out those two areas of manufacturing, which is the engine components and the powertrain, which goes with the engine management. All of that industry will keep increasing. And the component industry has to be ready and understand that this growth will continue in a fairly rapid pace. The second thing to remember is that a large part of the manufacturing investment for engine components, engine management systems, and the powertrains, a lot of that investment is made by the automobile manufacturer themselves. And to that extent, the impact on the component industry would be much less because that has to be met by the manufacturer. In addition, some manufacturers, at least, we do, give to the component manufacturers all the toolings and dies which are required for the expensive components. It's bought by us and then given for use to the component manufacturer, and therefore the financial risk to that extent is much less. So since the more capital-intensive part of the investment is to be made by the vehicle manufacturers, I think the risk element for the component industry is correspondingly much less. And if the vehicle manufacturer continues to make investments in growing his capacity and making IC engines, and in any case growing capacity, I think the component industry should feel confident to go ahead on that basis because a large part of your industry will depend on the number of vehicles which are going to be manufactured. So the point which comes out is that see what the vehicle manufacturers do and follow, and I think this lead time of 6 to 8 years, which is normally there for the payback period for investments in the component industry, will give you enough time to make adjustments in future investments because it is not going to happen absolutely overnight. You have also to keep in mind that export of automobiles will increase over the years. Africa is increasingly becoming a larger export market, and as the economic growth speeds up in Africa, this will provide a big opportunity. Many of the oil-producing countries may not also go in for EVs on a very large scale, and they also provide opportunities for vehicle exports. Even in the developed countries, whether they will have 100% change to EVs or not is not clear. And in these countries, if there is a reduction in the volume of the IC cars, which there will be, then the opportunities for component manufacturers from India to export competitively will also grow. So keep all these factors of the global markets in mind. But what does this mean? As has been said, the growth opportunities are there. The way the industry is going, the way the economy is going, the component industry can expand rapidly. But what really is required for that? And I think I'll repeat something which has been said earlier by Mr. Suzuki to ACMA some years ago. The first is maximize the generation of internal resources. Even today, there are many, many component manufacturers whose internal resource generation is quite low, and that leads to their being handicapped in the ability to find necessary resources for expansion, modernization, doing R&D, building engineering capacity, all of that gets handicapped. So maximization of internal resources is a must. And for doing that, cost reduction, especially in the area of wastage, non-value-adding activities, and overheads. We have also found that many companies have very high overheads. And I think that's something which needs to be looked at. And please look at reducing overheads and focus more on growing your companies, becoming global sized with a lot of money coming in for investment from internal resources, because I think that will give much greater satisfaction in the longer terms, the ability to become a global sized player. Along with that is the question of quality. And despite what Mr. Firodia said, our experience is that there is a lot of scope for quality improvement. And the Indian component industry has many areas still which are not up to global levels of quality. Just a few days back, Mr. Suzuki was here. He mentioned that a Japanese company which has a JV in India, and a very well-known Japanese company which has a JV in India with an Indian partner, and which was supplying parts to Japan. Those parts ran into serious quality problems. The result was the vehicle manufacturer had to reduce its volumes, production got cut, customers suffered, and various countermeasures had to be taken. Please remember that as volumes grow, a quality defect has a much wider impact. When there were small volumes, a recall or a quality problem was limited in its size. When volumes become much larger, the impact is much higher. So we can only take advantage of the opportunities which are coming if we recognize the fact that quality is going to be a very, very key factor. And our experience has been that while we talk of quality, we have a lot of programs for quality. Very few people do a real root cause analysis into why quality problems arise. And I think what is required is not for the OEMs to keep talking of quality. It's for each one of you to really recognize the root causes of why quality problems happen. And if you are then committed to quality, you will take corrective actions to prevent those causes arising in the future. But without a continuous and a very objective root cause analysis and making the necessary corrections and investing to make those corrections, it will not happen. So please remember, the future is bright. In Maruti alone, we will reach 2 million cars in 2020. 2.5 million cars about 2 to 3 years later. The Gujarat facility which Suzuki has put up, the first line of 250,000 has already been commissioned. Work is going on the second and third lines, and which will increase the capacity from Gujarat to 750,000 cars in the next 2 to 3 years. On the fourth line of a similar capacity, that is presently under review. And therefore, the target of 2.5 million, which I mentioned, because 1 million from there and 1.5 million from Haryana takes us to 2.5 million. So that is the kind of growth we are planning for which we are investing. And I hope that gives you some confidence of what we can go. Because remember, vehicle manufacturers and component industry are fundamentally dependent on each other. We have always worked on the principle that we are together, each one supports the other, and we go forward together. We have met challenges in the past. We will continue to meet challenges in the future because challenges will not disappear. So let's agree together to work to meet all challenges will come up and go forward and realize this potential which exists. Thank you very much and best wishes.